Technical writer in Red Hat.
Yep.
And it's yours.
Okay. So, first of all, I'm going to say that this is going to be more of a Q&A. I've gotten some questions from people ahead of time, but if any questions come up during this talk, then feel free to cut in, unless I'm in the middle of a sentence, and then do it. So I'm Mikey, like introduced before, and I write for Red Hat in Brno, or how do you say it in Czech? Brno? Or it's like, how do you say instructions? I don't know, I'm learning Czech, it's very slow. So I moved there about 6 months ago, and I document JBoss Fuse, which is a middleware product. So it's message processing, data integration within the JBoss sort of world. And they provide that on top of RHEL and all the other stuff. So I just started working there a few months ago, and it's actually my first dip into the open source world. Because before that, I've been a writer for about 5 years, 5.5 now. And I started with functional testing. I worked for HP Software, and then I moved to a company called Informatica, and I documented data integration there. So, as a writer, my path has been very more advanced or more technical than some other writers. But you guys are a lot more technical than I am. We had that conversation before about non-technical people being better writers. So, a lot of writers in the field don't actually come from a technical background. So I'm going to dive into that in a little bit. I basically grouped the questions in sort of areas, and I'm going to try to get through them, and it's more of my personal perspective of me being a writer in this world. So other people obviously work in different ways. Right, so actually Eric has made my job a lot easier because he gave some general background, and he gave some examples of how we work in documentation. So my experience mainly, there was questions here about which tools do we use, and how do you keep up with code bases, and what's the sort of process to work with. So the way that I've always worked was in parallel to the development process. And I'm talking formal documentation, the kind of doc set you get with each release of a product. So in my first job with HP Software, we're working FrameMaker, which is more of the classic word processor look and feel to it. But after that, and today as well in Red Hat, we work on XML-based single sourcing. So if you had the example of the restructured text with the semantic meanings and all that, then we basically use the same thing, except that all of our source files are XML, and then you have a publishing software that compiles everything into PDFs, EPUBs, whatever it is that you want. And it's all basically stored in a centralized style sheet, or in FrameMaker we had master pages and whatever. So you can have the warning tags or whatever.
I have a question. Do you actually have to write your documentation in XML?
Yeah, well, most of the time, because we have a lot of non-technical people that write documentation, we use WYSIWYG editors that display, more or less what it's going to look like. But you could always, the more hardcore writers will just basically work in the XML view or just in a text editor. So, the ones that don't mind, just staring at XML tags all day. But it's actually an advantage for getting people from a non-technical background that are still really good writers. So you don't actually have to look at the XML source unless sometimes there are certain troubleshooting things that you have to do. But it's a good way to ease the learning curve for new writers. And it's basically taking the concept of a code to docs generator, except that we treat our XML files as the source code. So we have version control for the most part. I don't know about smaller companies, but every company I've worked for had source control for the source topics and files for the documentation, especially when you're working in XML base. So it's a lot easier to run diffs and manage it just like any other code. I mean, when I was at HP Software, we used SVN, and now we use Git and Red Hat like everybody else does. But so it's really, we treat it, and this also answers another question about the code base. It's just like we keep up with the actual products that we document. We will always try to get the latest builds. If you have team leaders, or sometimes if you're working alone as a writer, you'll attend PM talks, like calls or whatever, like you have the weekly release meetings and things like that. So we try to stay involved in the process and always know what's coming. So that takes me into a different area. If like I said, and if you have any questions, you can stop me. But the process specifically I was asked about Red Hat and also in general. So at Red Hat, it's a little complicated because just a tad, because the kind of products that come out of Red Hat is such a wide scale, and they've had so many acquisitions during the years. I mean, JBoss used JBoss out of MQ, and basically a lot of the JBoss stuff is just things that have been coming in through the years, and it's kind of hard to integrate the development process, not to mention the documentation process. So I mean, for JBoss use specifically, we have hardly anybody. I work in the Brno office, but I have maybe 1-2 QA guys that work on this product. Everybody else is kind of like scattered. Everybody works from home in England, Germany, and Ireland, and the States. So you have a lot of, you have to deal with a lot of distributed teams. So it's a bit trickier to keep up with stuff, and a lot of times I'll play these, I just downloaded the latest build, like what am I going to find? So it's still being integrated. But for the most part, Red Hat's pretty organized on, it's based like on the RHEL and the platform stuff that they do. So they'll have the release planning, and then we'll try to keep up with that. And then if there are any specific things that happen along the way, like you will actually get a lot of documentation bugs, well, not a lot, depending. And so you basically try to stay in line with the development process. I'll give another example. In my previous job, we worked we worked Agile. So every time they'd have, we worked in kind of a Scrum Bun hybrid. Nobody really works pure Scrum nowadays, or pure Kanban. But we would always try to give the documentation for whatever was being developed during a certain sprint. We'd try to give that at the end of the next sprint. So you kind of keep an iteration plus one on a good day, and hope that nothing gets turned out. And this way we also match the content that we give to what's actually being worked on. Because if you're working on if you're developing a product, then you don't, well, I don't know. Maybe some of you just work on whatever component, but a lot of companies nowadays work on end-to-end testable scenarios. So we base a lot of our planning on the breakdown into stories or scenarios, and this is how we keep our content relevant and fresh in the developers' heads as well, because we just worked on this and then we give the documentation on that. Let's see. Any questions so far?
There was a question.
So documentation is always written after implementation is done?
For the most part, we don't really need to wait until the very end. Let's take the Agile example. If you have 2 weeks that you're developing a certain scenario or feature, normally about halfway through, we can start getting the actual content written. And then, so anywhere between 50 and 80% is where we can actually start working, depending on how complicated the feature or the product area is. But we do a lot of our doc specking or outlining much earlier. Like, let's say if you have a planning meeting for a certain iteration, then already according to the list that we get, not to mention the overall release requirements, we'll already start outlining what we want to do and how we want it to look like. So we call those doc plans or doc specs or whatever. So those we usually get out the door early. And some writers, I'm totally guilty of that, just start beefing it up already, just so you don't want to get stuck at the end. Although sometimes that creates a bit of a, oh, I've written all this stuff and then they decided not to develop it. So it's always a balance. We're trying to keep up with that. But I guess you guys have features that you work on that end up not being implemented as well, so you can relate.
So what is it like typical reader of your documentation? Is it the user of the component or the developer of the component?
See, that's obviously a two-level question, because for the most part, the products that I was documenting were for developers. So they are the user. First and foremost, when we write formal documentation, user guides, installation guides, it's meant for the people who buy the software.
But the people that who are actually developers, but the developers that use your library or whatever, they are not the developers. They're actually open source or
they're not the
develop or contribute to
it within the company, right? Okay. I mean, I haven't actually contributed to any community-based documentation, so everything that I say comes from I work for a company, they make a product, they sell it, and then I write for them. So to me, the users are the people that buy the product. Okay. But a lot of times we'll actually get requests to review specs or readmes or things that are not necessarily a part of the official documentation. And so that's the kind of extra thing that we do. But for the main part, we write for the end users of the software. I've written, it depends. I've written for admins and for developers, and I was joking around with Honza before. So for the most part, the documentation is for developers, and then we throw in a dashboard or something for the business analysts so they can be happy with their graphs, or So, but yes. Internal documentation is mostly stuff that we write for ourselves, like how to publish docs with this process, but not necessarily inside the company.
Yeah. Question, don't take it the wrong way, but how?
I always take it the wrong way.
It could be taken the wrong way, but how can you document something that you obviously didn't write? It's like
that's actually an advantage. It is.
Yeah, I don't understand. How do you?
If I don't know how to code,
right?
If I don't know how to code,
if you didn't write the code,
right? Well, first of all, let me give you a little bit of 2 sentences on my background. I was a film student, and I worked in television, and I retrained as a technical writer 5 years ago, based solely on the fact that I speak and write native level English, and that I can teach myself software applications very, very quickly. So having a technical talent helps, but for the most part it's actually, unless you're documenting something super deep dive, it's actually an advantage not written the code, because I am not attached to, I'm not emotionally attached to the things that, the things I would write.
Understand what those people write.
So my job is to translate stuff from developerish to English, right? So, but think about it, when you have a release planning document, right, where you have the requirements. The requirements come, first of all, from the customer. You have functional requirements, and then you break that down into technical requirements and see how physically you put in the code. I don't have to care about the code itself. All I care about is what the software does. Right? If I document an API, yes, obviously I need to know what the methods and the arguments and everything is about. But I've written Java docs for things not knowing how to program in Java, so I basically, because, and hopefully people will put in some drafts of what everything is supposed to do. And the more I do it, the easier it is for me to recognize it. But we research ourselves, we play with the software to see what happens. So yeah, we end up doing a lot of unofficial QA work. Yeah.
So what's your like typical input? Like output is obviously like written documentation in English.
Yeah.
And what's your
What do I have to work with?
Yeah. Well, like what
What's
kind
my
of
research?
information or source of information you use to actually write the documentation? Is
Right.
it like that you call to the developers, or
Right.
you read their developish English and translate that, or
See, that depends. For the most part, the first source I have is the software itself. Unless it's something brand new from scratch, most of the time I go into a company and there's already a software product, right? That's just being updated with every version. So I already have something I can play with, which is where the technical sort of talent background gives me personally an advantage, is that I can sort of play around with it. And luckily most of the software products I've documented had a proper GUI, so I didn't have to run through, and I'm absolutely rubbish with command line. I don't know Bash. I'm still learning all this, all of that sort of area. But luckily for me, we have a GUI now for Fuse, so I feel totally comfortable. But so the first thing is the product itself. You're expected to sort of dive in and see if you can swim, right? And then we have whatever specs or requirements we get from the product managers. We have, because you're not going to start writing code without planning it. So we have planning documents, and then, right, so after I collect all of the information that I can independently, then I might grab a developer and say, hey, can you like demo this thing for me? Or can I send you a draft of an outline to see if I'm like, if I'm not talking absolute, gibberish here. So we check in with the developers all the time. The developers, the architects, the UX people especially. There's always kind of a special bond between UX people and documentation people. Because A, we're not customer focused like the product managers, so we're not thinking how many features we can shove in, for the customer to be happy. We're not developers or QA engineers, so we don't we don't live inside the components. We don't live in the code, right? So, and the user experience people, the UX people, they look at the customer, they care about the customer, but the customer doesn't pay their bills. You know what I mean? So we have kind of an outside perspective, and we also get to write about the entire product, not just that one component that the developer worked on. So, so then after I take all that, and then I'll sit down either with the developers or whoever, then you kind of start beefing it up and putting in the content. And at the end, you test it and you publish it. Well, you publish it and then you test it. Well, when I talk about publishing, I'm not talking about publishing as in to the public. I meant using a content publishing system, generator, to publish an output. So it's publishing, I think, is taken from journalism. So you look at the output, you make sure everything looks good, and then you can release it into the world. Any other? How much time do I have? I don't remember where we started.
10-15.
Okay.
about 10 minutes.
Okay. Let's see. I've done that. Somebody asked, do I work in a team, and how do the team members collaborate? So in the smaller companies, a lot of times you'll have just the one writer, because for every 10 to 20 developers, depending on how nice the company is, because the more developers you have, the harder my job is. So anywhere between 10 and 20 developers, you have one writer. And for every maybe 3 to 5 writers, you might have a team leader or an editor or like in Red Hat, right now in Brno, we have about 23 writers with 2 team leaders and a manager that sits on top of all of us. And then in Brisbane, Australia, there's another like 70 or 80 or something crazy like that. I've never worked in a company with so many writers. The fact that we keep all our stuff in source control makes it a lot easier to collaborate, because if somebody can be working on whatever files, and then you try to type it in, and then some other person is working on them. So it's a lot easier to keep track of who works on what when you version control. And most of the time for a documentation team, you would have somebody in charge of assigning the work, basically. So we divide the work between us, each person according to either their experience with that product area or whatever it is that they feel like, I want to do this project. So, you know, we do that. And then everything kind of gets tied in together, so you each take up a certain part. And then we have sync meetings as well to see where we are and to see if maybe like we have too much work or we need to ask help from another team or whatever it is. Yes?
So if you work in a team, like how do you synchronize like the terminology and all the like the generic tone of the documentation?
Right. Well, this is where I was mentioning internal documentation. That is also a part. Any company that has a good team of technical writers that has been there for a little while will have a style guide. A style guide and a terminology guide. And that's basically what we use. And also the fact that we use structured content. And like Eric said, I have a tag called warning. I don't need to know what it's going to look like, right? And there is a very deeply hidden secret, which was we plagiarize like mad, right? The first thing that I do when I go to write about something that already has like a sister topic or a product area, I look at what's already written, and I also look, if you have several doc teams, like at Red Hat, for example, for every product there's a team. I usually can find the team that has that's been there for a while and is already a bit solid. If I'm writing about something completely new, I'll be like, okay, how did they do this? How did they format it? Which heading styles do they use? So in addition to the official style guide, there's also the field rules.
Is the Red Hat style guide published?
I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't checked.
And open, not, obviously it's rendered.
No, you mean we have, you might be referring to the brand, and I actually don't know. That's something interesting I will check.
Questions about the style guide? Is it like, what is most important in the style guide? Is it that like when you're talking about the user, you use just like you should install or one should install or the user should or user installs or what is like typical like.
I understand what you're trying to say. There's a difference here between company specific style and sort of general tech writing 101 rules, right? And this is actually, somebody asked, what did I study? I studied nothing to do with technical communications, and I'm actually, the technical communications and technical writing is like the missing discipline in the IT field. And they're just starting, like I think there's a couple universities in Ireland who do that. Wait. So there are general guidelines for Tech Writing 101, but I've seen so many deviations from that. I mean, I've seen an entire guide where they used should all the time, but they did it consistently, and it didn't actually break any grammar rules, right? So it's just their style. But the style guide will have things like which words you should capitalize, and whether you use gerund, which is the verb ing, like doing, writing. There's big, huge, fiery debates about that. The gerund flame wars. So that kind of thing will be in the style guide, and I've worked for 3 companies now, and a lot of things are significantly different between them.
So
but a lot of
what is the best, like on your experience, like what do you prefer, like using, or how you should address the user, or what words you should use or you shouldn't use?
Well, that is actually
your opinion, basically, not the Red Hat style guide.
I'm a technical writer, therefore I have no opinion. Technical writers are expected not to have an ego about these things, because we're kind of like SWAT agents being parachuted into companies, expected to pick up the technology and the styles and whatever is already there and just bust out really awesome documentation according to what the company wants.
Like let's say you're starting a company and somebody is like writing documentation. What would be the style guide you would recommend there?
IBM.
IBM is a style guide.
That's usually the go-to when in doubt for the interwebs.
So what's IBM style guide looks like?
Because it's really boring. But if you don't have any other reference, that's the best thing you should do, is you start out with the boring stuff. Hold on a second.
What are the other holy words for tech writers?
Holy words?
Wars.
Wars, holy wars.
Gerunds and...
Gerunds and
Hey.
there's a lot of, I'm trying to think. Whether to use, oh, it's the warning versus caution versus, warning versus caution is always like, you know. There's a few, there's the last comma in a list. You know, that's, you know, if you say this, and that, whether you put a comma before that. Like, I mean, you guys fight over, like, you have flame wars over, like, you know, a little tiny snippet in the code. Like, we have wars about commas. You know, so
we also have
wars about spaces after commas.
right, or whether you have a double space after a sentence or a single space.
Do you get issues with like American English spellings?
See, that's actually very simple because unless you're writing something that's specific to, let's say, the UK market, you always revert to American English. Yes. It's all, but no, you know why? Tyler, I'm half American, right? American English is what certain people that are some mutual friends of ours would call simplified English. And it's true. And one of the things that, one of the questions that I was asked is, how do I get better? Do I read? Do I write? And actually, in order to be a better writer, I have to dumb it down to 4th grade level English because most of your readers are non-native English speakers. So you have to keep everything present, simple. Yes?
Can we do this instead of your talk at the conference?
I can do that. We can do that. We can do a lightning talk where people just, you know, experts. But these are all, we're gonna have writers, you know, so they all know the flame wars about commas.
No, but that'll be even more fun because then they'll start them.
I am not going to be in the center of no flame war. Thank you very much.
I actually was wanting to ask the question, so you get more proficient in reading more,
Right.
writing more.
Right. So in order to be a better writer in general, you should read. But for technical writing specifically, reading, unless you're reading technical documentation, mainly to figure out what not to do, then, like, I don't know, reading novels is not going to make me a better technical writer. On the contrary, I need to clean out all the personality from the writing when I write technical writing, right? We have a new guy coming into my team and he's a journalist, right? He's not a technical writer. He's got amazing English and he's really great, which is why we hired him. But I'm going to have to sort of break him down and rebuild him. So I tried to keep up with my English in general by reading books because technical writing has, like, made me lose a lot of words.
You touched on it a little bit, like, what are the common mistakes that you read other people's documentation and you go, what the fuck were they thinking? Like
Passive tense.
okay.
Passive tense.
Can you elaborate a
Right.
little bit?
Let me explain. Yeah, let me explain a little bit of something so I can give you a bit of context.
By
A
zombies.
lot of what?
But if you can say by zombies at the end.
That is great. Okay, so yeah.
I didn't learn English in school, so can you give an example of what?
Right. So before I do that, and give you a little bit of context. A lot of one of the reasons why we have to keep the English super simple is not just because a lot of our readers are not native English speakers, but because a lot of stuff gets translated to other languages. So if you want to translate something from English to Czech, right? You can't say like. The on button of the projector should be pressed, 3 times to make something else happen. I don't know exactly what. So that's also using the word should and using passive voice in the same sentence. So that's a kind of a compound example. We get a lot of ricochets from a lot of Asian languages and the Slavic languages as well, because we have to keep everything super simple. Like, we can't even use, we have to be really sparing about using the word it. And we can't use any conjunctions, like don't. Is that conjunction? I wasn't an English major, so I don't know what things are called. So there's a lot of stuff that you really can't do, even though it's correct grammar, just because it wouldn't be translated well. So that's the context.
But isn't it sort of the job of the translator to shield people from the idioms of the individual languages?
Yeah, and it would be great if the translators actually worked for your company and weren't outsourced for like $2 an hour in India, which is a lot of people do. So
I would love to see
technical writers get. Somebody asked how much I get paid. A lot more than a translator.
Passive voice example.
Passive voice, yes. So
This question should never have been asked.
So the passive voice is one of the common mistakes I find in the documentation. Another one is conjunctions, and a lot of it is, I remember and the problem starts is that some companies do outsource as well their technical writers. So when I came into Informatica, there was a guide that I had to basically rewrite from scratch, because it was written like a bad blog, and it had like commas in all the wrong places, and it even mentioned the word "I," like "I will do this." I don't remember what it was, but it was really bad. So that's a lot of the stuff that we find is just basic English and basic tech writing inconsistencies, and somebody puts in too much personality. Yes.
Still haven't given an example of passive voice.
What do you mean? I did.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah, I said the button on the projector should be.
Oh, that was a complex example.
The car was driven by.
See, that's another flavor actually, because when I say the screen, the page is displayed. Okay, so some companies will actually allow that, saying this page is displayed. And that will be okay, but then you get into should I say is displayed, or should I say this page opens, appears? I actually worked in, in Informatica, where in the style guide it was said, do not use appear. It is not a magic trick. You know, it just poof, it appears out of nowhere. And that's the kind of stuff that doesn't get translated well.
So what's the proper way to say that?
I should say show.
Well, you can see, but if you're saying that this page shows, it has to show something. This page shows the user credentials you need to log in. It has to show something. Or you can't say this page displays, because it displays. It's the problem starts when you get into ambiguities. Display and show are both a noun and a verb. So unless you make it very clear from the context, it's not going to be translated well into languages that are totally different from English. So, did you?
If I say the window shows up.
Shows up is slang. Shows up. It's like it opens the door and it shows up. See, that's the kind of stuff only tech writers always agree. No.
Sorry, I'm a lot of time from my first show.
No, it's fine. That is one of the considerations that you have to think about is you don't want to humanize your program. So like there are some things more like using the word there, like there no, like there as in like their pies, you know? These pies are their pies, right? Like THEIR. That implies human possessiveness. So like you don't want to do that. You always want to spell everything out. So instead of saying like this page shows its title. I don't know, I'm flaking for examples. Then you have to say the title. So you have to qualify all of your terms. And you can't assume that everybody will know what you mean when you say it, there, or any other things like that. So you have to remove all the ambiguity. Yeah.
Maybe this question is totally out of scope, like Red Hat style guide or whatever. But can you have like tiny jokes in the documentation? Because like in many open source, in many like open source like libraries, there was like how to's whatever, and in the status it was, oh, you obviously don't want to do that, and Actually, it was
Well, here be dragons.
easier
I'm not
for
gonna write
me
here be dragons and, like,
read the whole documentation or to
Yeah.
read the manual, and there was like tiny jokes in
See,
the
the
middle.
whole thing, the manual, because you have a lot of people collaborating on the documentation, you need to give a unified voice. The only way to do that is make it really dry. It has to be informative. It has to be easy to read. And well, listen, I don't know about community docs really, but I will give the example that when I started working at Red Hat, we have a management console that's a web-based console, and it's based on a project called Praha-pyvo, and their tagline is, "Don't you wish your console was hot like me?" And it shows up right in the front when you open this thing, and I'm like, yeah, we can't do that, So you get a lot of things like that, but in general, you have to make it as plain as possible because it's not supposed to be entertaining.
Yeah, but sometimes it's easier to actually read the whole documentation if it's not like wall bare tutorial language, but when there's like
A more informal writing.
Yeah, more informal. Let's say not jokes, but more informal language.
I know
do you recommend like using informal language sometimes, or?
Well, it depends. Let's say, for example, I want to have a website where people can create, I don't know, videos based on their pictures, and I don't know, I'm just giving you a random example. And then you have the let me show you how to get started. Getting started, a lot of times that'll be more interactive. Like you'll have some animation or things will keep popping up and you're like, here you do this and then you do that. There, because of your target audience, you can afford to have a little bit more personality because it's also serves a marketing function. Yeah. If the writing, if the documents that people read, that the users read, so serves a marketing function, then it does make sense. I mean, I know Google has a lot of little, like he's dead Jim, and when he shows an error, but that's different to I'm writing a security guide for how to process messages and whatever. Like that people don't really.
In Java.
In Java. But so if it doesn't serve a purpose. And besides, when you have considerations like translation and anything that can be interpreted, like there's the whole big discussion, that's another flame war, invalid, right? The word invalid, in certain countries, you can pronounce it invalid, which is not politically correct, right? So I've had to actually go through tons of documentation topics to search and hunt for these invalid places and changes that are not valid.
Retarded.
Right, so it's like, so this is the kind of thing where you need to remove ambiguity. And once you start throwing in some Easter eggs, it can be considered rude.
While we are on the subject of political correctness,
But I can't hear you.
how do you deal with gender issues? Like, do you call the user he or she or it or they or what the fuck?
You.
So you always like second version.
It's either, if I'm giving an instruction, if I'm writing tasks, it's always you. And sometimes when I write conceptual documents, like who are my users, right? Like the system administrator does something. You just spell out their role. You don't say he, she, or it. And you don't write they, because that's also too ambiguous. We try to spell out and qualify all the, like let's say have an administrator, a developer, and then it's neutral. So you keep everything very neutral.
There's one question.
Yeah.
Just you mentioned the IBM guys, like how long is all the pages?
I don't know, it's online and I basically just search for what I need. So it's pretty hefty.
Yeah. Where is like 5 pages, 50 pages, 500?
I have no idea. Like I said, I only use the online version of it, so I never counted the pages. But it's organized alphabetically by terms, really. And there's quite a few things in there. I have no idea. Huh? It's kind of like a tech writing Bible, so it's pretty big. That's what we call it in Israel. We can joke about things like that. I guess I'm more or less done with the questions that I was given. So if you have new questions, yes. Burning desires?
Taxonomy is really, really hard. Is there, do you know any kind of like standard references for things you should include, things you shouldn't include? For like, say I have a Python project and I want to document it.
Right.
Like I need to know what pages to include. Or, you know, like the actual taxonomy of what I'm writing about, right? Like here are all the different pages, here is some kind of structure to them. Is there any kind of reference?
You're talking about pages as in
just structure of the document. So it's like
right.
all of our documentation. Here's like the where you start. Here's like the tutorial section. Here's just kind of the.
Are you talking about a documentation set?
Sure.
Like when
Let me backtrack. What's a documentation set?
a documentation library, basically.
So it's like for a project, all of the documentation. Is there something,
okay. How do you decide which guides to write and?
Like what is the whole set of the things I need?
Right. Well, I guess for the most part, we don't really have to face that decision because you go into a company that already has some sort of a doc library. But if you're starting everything from scratch, you need to look at what kind of product you're using. If you're creating let's say a website, and you want to have a FAQ, then you need to think about who your users are. But if you start to develop, let's say some sort of enterprise database management software, then you have different roles. Yes.
I have a new holy word for you.
Uh-oh.
So, what about the argument that everything in the FAQ is actually a bug that should be fixed and not added to an FAQ?
No, that's a release notes. The release notes is the magic word during any sort of time that leads up to a release. Oh, just write it in the release notes and take care of it later. It's where all the the bugs that nobody wants to fix go to die. Depending on what the software, or I'm looking at it from a software documentation perspective, who my users are, and based on that, I can build. Let's say I have an administrator, I have a developer, I have an operator, a business analyst, and then a lot of times things change. I've written. I actually had. When I was in Informatica, I was writing for one product called B2B Data Exchange, and then they used that as a basis to make another product, which is a data integration hub. So, I ended up single sourcing a lot of the same topics, but I did write a lot of things from scratch. And I actually had a chance to shuffle things around a little bit, because I was dealing with a documentation library with, I don't know how many, 6, 7, or 8 books that were organized in not the most brilliant way, but you can't start, there are certain things you can't really touch anymore, or that you don't have time because you're busy documenting new stuff. But you collaborate with the product managers to see what kind of users the customer splits to, what's sort of the division, and if they have anything new and cool that they want to document, like if say your product works in a high availability environment or on big data Hadoop stuff. So like you'll have one guide just for that. So it serves a marketing purpose as well as a functional purpose. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
How do you decide you want to become a tech writer?
That's here lies the story. I actually grew up. My dad works in. He's been a QA and tech pre-sales, and he's been working in the high tech fields for many years. I'm just going to answer it very quickly. And so I always grew up with technology around me, and I was always attracted to it. But I wanted to be a film student and do a bunch of things. And then when I moved back from California to Israel, I got sick of working in television. It was paying shit, and it was just not fun. And then I found out that a lot of people that come to Israel specifically retrain as technical writers, because we have a lot of Jewish immigration from English-speaking countries. So there's a system set up for people to retrain. And I was like, okay, I've always been attracted to the high-tech fields. I'm not a programmer. I have no computer science degree. What can I do that utilizes skills that I already have to be able to work in that environment and improve myself. So that's what me personally made that decision for me. And I was able to retrain in a fairly short time with an internship. So, you wanted to ask, or you wanted to cut me off, or?
Basically both, but
Feel free to cut me off. I'm just going to.
yeah, I think we'll have like 1 or 2 questions left, and yeah.
I just like what's the one thing to motivate technical writers to your company.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I can't
What
hear
do
that.
you think- what you can offer to technical writer to motivate him to join your company?
The current company that I work for.
That's a very inappropriate question. What would it take for you to switch?
To switch to a different company?
Not that personal.
Everything's personal. Well, basically, we get. Right. So the thing is that a lot of technical writers, because we're expected to learn things ourselves, a support system to be able to integrate into the company's technologies and processes is always good. Like, I mean, the fact that I can get basically any training I want, limited only by the power of my brain and how fast I can learn things, how much time, how many hours I have during the day, is amazing. Because as a technical writer, you don't really have a managerial food chain. So the only way for me to develop and, you know, promote myself and increase and develop my career is to expand laterally. So a place that will give me a chance to do things besides just sitting and writing documentation all the time. Because it can be a bit more of the same after a while, but because, let's say, I can be involved in design discussions, like to me personally, because I'm really OCD about these things, then to me that's attractive. Other writers might be motivated by the fact that you can play with a lot of different technologies, or the fact that you don't. Some writers aren't necessarily as emotionally attached to what they're documenting. So as long as, you know, for a lot of people, as long as I can work in that environment and not be treated as a redheaded stepchild, you know, like to be a company that cares about their writers is really important. Like a lot of times the writers will fall in between DevOps, enablement, you know, somewhere around it and kind of hovering over and around the actual R&D units. So having worked in an agile unit and being a real integrated part was amazing, you know, because they actually like cared and they had a column in their Kanban board for documentation, which they never used. 2 years I tried. Yes, sorry. I hope that answered your question.
Last question from Eric.
Last call.
Better not fuck it.
Yeah, better not be a long one.
So this is actually kind of a follow-on. So if you're an open source project, how do you entice a tech writer to help with your documentation?
That's Finton's talk. The community wrote my docs. I actually have close to no experience with community projects, so I really can't answer that question because I don't know. I do know, I've been talking to people while traveling recently with FOSDEM and then DevCon for people to tell me they have like doc hack fests where they'll just get together for like a week and like write documentation for, you know, contribute to the documentation. I've yet to be in one, but it will be nice, although I could probably do better as an editor rather than a writer because it's easier to edit documentation about something you know nothing about than actually to write about it. So.
You should organize one. You should organize one.
Okay.
So in Budapest then.
So let's have like 5 minutes.